In November 1998, 8 experienced hikers set out to summit the Bitterroot Range in the Montana Rockies, seeking adventure and winter memories. By the time search teams arrived, all 8 had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only their abandoned campsite and a trail of questions that would haunt investigators for decades. But when an avalanche reveals something impossible buried in the ice 25 years later, the truth proves far more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. The coffee had gone cold again. Alex Carter noticed this the way he noticed most things in his apartment, distantly, as though cataloging a detail in someone else's life. He was sitting at the kitchen table in Denver on a Tuesday morning in late November 2024, going through a stack of bills that needed paying and a calendar that needed organizing. And outside the window, the first real snow of the season was falling in slow, unhurried curtains. It was the kind of morning that felt complete in itself, quiet and unremarkable and safe. His cat, a gray tabby named Marsh, sat on the windowsill watching the snow with the focused intensity of a creature that has decided this is the most important thing happening in the world. Alex had bought groceries the day before. He had plans to call his mother that evening. He had a dentist appointment scheduled for Thursday that he was mildly dreading in the comfortable way of a person whose problems are small and manageable. The phone rang at 8:47 a.m. It was Director Haynes from the Regional Missing Persons Bureau, which meant Alex was already reaching for his jacket before the call ended, because Haynes did not phone people on Tuesday mornings to discuss small and manageable problems. A team of 8 hikers had gone missing in the Bitterroot Range in southwestern Montana, a stretch of the Rocky Mountains so remote that the nearest town with a gas station was 40 minutes away on a good road, and there were no good roads up there in late November. The group had set out on November 20th, experienced outdoors people, all of them, properly equipped, properly registered. They had been due back on the 23rd. Today was the 26th. A Forest Service helicopter had spotted their campsite from the air 2 days ago. The tents were standing. The gear was in place. The hikers were not. Alex was on a flight to Missoula by noon. He had worked missing persons for 11 years, long enough to understand that most disappearances have explanations that are tragic but logical. Falls, hypothermia, disorientation in deteriorating weather. The mountains do not need mystery to kill people. They are quite efficient without it. He had trained himself early in his career to approach every case as a puzzle with a solution, because investigators who allowed themselves to be seduced by the idea of the inexplicable tended to stop looking for the actual answer. His supervisor from his first year on the job had told him that. A tired woman named Patricia Greer, who had 30 years of solved cases behind her, and very little patience for what she called dramatic interpretation. "Stick to what the evidence tells you," she had said, "not what it makes you feel." Alex had stuck to that principle through every case in 11 years. He had found children in storm drains, and elderly men in ravines, and young women in the apartments of people they had trusted. He had delivered answers to families who needed them, and he had done it by following logic wherever it led, even when it led to places that broke his heart. The one case he had never solved was his brother's. Noah Carter had been 19 years old when he walked into the mountains of northern Colorado on a solo camping trip in the summer of 2008, and did not walk back out. They had found his tent, his pack, his boots arranged outside the tent, as though he had stepped out for a moment and would return shortly. They had never found Noah. Alex had been 23, freshly graduated, about to start a job at a landscaping company, while he figured out what he wanted to do with his life. What he did with his life turned out to be this: year after year, the search for people who had gone somewhere they could not come back from. His therapist said this was understandable. Alex said it was practical. He was good at it, and it needed doing. The flight landed in Missoula in a light snowfall that the locals were treating with complete indifference. Alex picked up his rental car and drove south toward the Bitterroot Valley, watching the mountains rise on either side of the highway, with the slow drama of something that has been performing this particular act for a very long time. He had been to Montana twice before, both times in summer, and had thought it beautiful in the distracted way of someone who was there for work. In November, it was something else. The peaks were white, and the lower slopes were dark with pine, and the sky was the flat gray of a closed door. Beautiful was not quite the right word for it. Serious, maybe. The mountains in winter looked serious. He met the local sheriff at the trailhead just after 4 in the afternoon, the light already beginning to fail. Sheriff Dana Kowalski was a compact woman in her late 40s, with the careful eyes of someone who had learned to read terrain and people with equal attention. She shook his hand briskly and handed him a folder of preliminary reports, and as they walked toward the staging area where search and rescue teams were gathered, she gave him the short version of what they knew. The group was affiliated with an outdoor club based in Bozeman, 8 members ranging in age from 21 to 54. The expedition leader was a man named Cole, first name James, experienced mountaineer with 15 years of high-altitude climbing behind him. His sister Lily had been part of the group, along with 6 others whose names Alex read from the manifest as they walked. The last confirmed contact was a satellite messenger ping on the morning of November 21st, reporting good conditions and expected progress toward their planned summit. After that, nothing. The campsite had been secured and photographed by the initial response team. Alex looked through the photographs on Kowalski's tablet as they stood in the gathering dark. 8 tents in an orderly arrangement, cooking equipment, rope coils and ice axes, personal gear bags still packed as though ready for use. And the detail that had appeared in Haynes's initial briefing and had been troubling Alex for the entire flight. A set of boot prints leading away from the campsite toward the upper slopes. Not 8 sets, not scattered in multiple directions as you would expect from a group that had become disoriented or separated. One continuous line of prints, single file, as though the entire group had formed a queue and walked upward in an orderly procession. "What is up there?" Alex asked, pointing at the photographs showing the direction the prints led. "Nothing accessible," Kowalski said. "The upper face gets very technical above 11,000 feet. There is a ridge system that experienced climbers can navigate, and below that a series of ice formations, some of them with cave systems inside. We did not fully explore that area in the initial search because the avalanche risk was rated high." Alex looked up from the tablet. He looked at the mountain in the last of the afternoon light, the white upper slopes catching what remained of the sun while everything below sank into shadow. The boot prints in the photographs had been partially obscured by new snowfall, but enough remained to show the single-file formation clearly. 8 experienced hikers walking upward in a line, in November, away from their shelter and equipment, in the direction of terrain that offered nothing but danger. He had seen strange things in 11 years. He had learned not to be hasty about conclusions. But standing at the base of that mountain in the November cold, looking at photographs of 8 pairs of boots marching upward in perfect order, Alex Carter felt something that he had carefully trained himself not to trust. A feeling not quite like fear and not quite like recognition, but somewhere between the two. As though some part of him already knew what kind of answer this mountain was going to give him. He pushed the feeling down and opened his notebook. The coffee at the sheriff's office, he had been told, was reliably terrible. He was looking forward to it. The bodies were found on the third day of the expanded search operation, when a team equipped for high-altitude recovery managed to reach the ice formations below the upper ridge. The avalanche risk had moderated overnight, following a shift in temperature, opening a narrow window that the team leader, a veteran rescue specialist named Ruiz, used with the efficiency of someone who understood that windows like this did not stay open long. Alex was on the second helicopter into the site, arriving 40 minutes after the initial discovery call came through. He had been awake since 4 in the morning. He did not think this had impaired his judgment, but he also understood that 11 years of practice did not make a person immune to the effects of altitude and cold and insufficient sleep. And so he made himself move slowly and look carefully at everything before reaching any conclusions. The bodies were arranged on a slope below a significant ice formation, a wall of glacial material that rose 30 feet and extended horizontally for perhaps twice that distance before curving back into the mountain. Alex counted 7 figures in his first survey of the scene. Their bright, technical jackets stood out against the snow with a vividness that felt almost indecent. They were positioned in a rough, descending line from the base of the ice wall, spaced roughly 15 feet apart, as though they had been walking away from the formation and had stopped, one by one, at measured intervals. That was the first thing that troubled him, not the deaths themselves, which were terrible but within the category of things that mountains do to people, but the spacing. Hypothermia does not arrange people in measured rows. Avalanche victims cluster and scatter. Exposure produces huddles or solitary collapses. This looked like something else, though Alex did not yet have a word for what it looked like. Ruiz joined him as he walked the line of bodies, both of them moving carefully through the scene while the recovery team documented everything with photographs and measurements. The medical examiner from Missoula would make the formal determinations, but even on initial inspection, the cause of death appeared consistent with extreme cold exposure. All 7 individuals were frozen solid, their faces still visible enough to suggest they had not been in distress in their final moments. That was the second thing. Their faces were calm. Not the rictus of pain that cold sometimes produced, not the blankness of unconsciousness, but something that read, insofar as a frozen face could be said to read anything, as peaceful, even attentive, as though they had all looked at the same thing at the moment of death and found it satisfying. "Where is the 8th member?" Alex asked. The manifest had listed 8. He could only account for 7. Ruiz pointed further up the slope, toward the base of the ice wall. "We have one more up there, separate from the group. You need to see her." He followed Ruiz to a position near the ice formation itself, where another member of the team was crouched beside a figure partially sheltered by an overhang of ice. This person was positioned differently from the others, on her side, facing the ice wall, one arm extended as though she had been writing or carving something in the frozen surface. Alex knelt beside the recovery specialist and looked at what the woman had scratched into the ice in the last of her strength. The words were uneven and large, each letter taking obvious effort, the kind of carving produced by someone who understood they had limited time and wanted the message to be impossible to miss. "Do not follow the light. It is not what it appears. It knows your name because it learned it from the ones who came before you. Do not go deeper. Do not listen. Whatever it promises, it is a lie made from something true, and that is the most dangerous kind." Alex read the message twice. Then he looked at the woman's extended hand, the fingers still curved around what turned out to be a small folding knife she had used to scratch the letters into the ice. He looked at her face. She was young, late 20s, and like the others, her expression in death was inexplicably composed. Whatever fear had driven her to carve that message had apparently resolved itself before the end. That troubled him more than the fear would have. He stood and looked at the ice wall above him. In the late morning light, which fell on the formation at a low angle and penetrated the surface to a depth of several inches, the ice had a quality he had not initially noticed from a distance. It was not the uniform white-gray of ordinary glacial ice. It was faintly luminous in a way that had nothing to do with the light striking it from outside, a dim inner glow that pulsed, very slowly, like a breath. Like something alive and patient behind the glass. Alex looked at this for a moment without speaking. Then he took out his notebook and wrote down what he saw, exactly and without interpretation, the way Patricia Greer had taught him. He sent a photograph of the carved message to Director Haynes with a single line of text beneath it. This is not a straightforward case. He did not receive a reply for 3 hours, which told him that Haynes was reading the message carefully and consulting people he did not want to name in an email. The identification process that afternoon established that the woman who had carved the message was Lily Cole, 26 years old, sister of the expedition leader James Cole. Her satellite messenger was recovered with her body. When the technical team downloaded its log back at the staging area, they found that she had sent a final message at 11:52 p.m. on November 22nd, 12 hours after the last routine ping. The message consisted of 8 words. Went inside to find James. Something wrong down there. James Cole's body was not among the 7 recovered. The manifest said 8. They had found 7. One of those 7 was Lily, who had gone inside something to find her brother, and had come back out to leave a warning. James had not come back out at all. Alex stood in the staging area's makeshift operations room that evening, looking at the topographical map and the coordinates Ruiz had marked for the ice formation. The satellite imagery showed the formation extending back into the mountain at a significant depth. Not simply a surface feature, an entrance, something hollow beneath and behind that wall of glowing ice. He thought about what Lily had scratched into the surface with a folding knife in the last hours of her life. It knows your name because it learned it from the ones who came before you. He thought about the 7 bodies arranged in their measured, peaceful row, faces turned toward whatever light had been the last thing they saw. He told himself these things had explanations. He had always been able to tell himself that before. The words came easily from long practice, and they settled over his thinking like a hand pressing something down. Tomorrow they would enter the cave system. Tomorrow there would be evidence that pointed toward the real answer. He had never failed to find an answer in 11 years, and he was not going to fail now. And whatever was in that mountain was going to turn out to be something that had a name and a mechanism and a cause. Outside the staging area, the temperature had dropped to 20 below. The mountain was invisible in the dark, but standing at the window with a cup of terrible coffee going cold in his hand, Alex could see, very faintly, on the upper slopes above the tree line, a dim and steady glow. They entered the cave on the morning of the 4th day, a team of 6, Alex, Ruiz, 2 additional recovery specialists named Park and Domenica, and a geologist from the State University named Hargrove, who had driven up overnight after Haynes finally replied to Alex's message with a series of instructions that included the words, "Bring someone who understands ice." The 6th member of the team was a rescue specialist named Grant, a 15-year veteran who wore his experience quietly in the way of people who have done dangerous things long enough to stop needing to announce it. The entrance to the cave system was a gap in the ice wall that the avalanche had widened to approximately 4 feet across and 6 feet high. Before the avalanche, it had apparently been a narrow fissure, barely navigable, which explained why previous searchers had not investigated it thoroughly. Now it opened into a passage that descended at a moderate angle, the walls smooth and faintly luminous in the way that Alex had observed from outside. Though inside the cave, the quality of the light was different. Not simply a surface reflection. The light seemed to come from within the ice itself, from deep inside its crystalline structure, and it shifted very slowly as they moved past it, the way a fire moves. Not bright enough to navigate by, just present, just there. The temperature inside was lower than outside, which was not what caves typically did. Caves usually offered some shelter from extreme cold, some moderating effect of the Earth's internal warmth. This one seemed to conduct cold actively, as though the rock and ice were drawing heat outward rather than holding it in. Alex noted this. Hargrove noted it too, crouching at intervals to press his gloved hand against the wall and look at his instruments with an expression that started as professional interest and gradually became something more complicated. At 60 feet in, they found the first evidence of previous entry. A piton driven into the ice at shoulder height, with the corroded remnant of a carabiner still attached. Hargrove dated the equipment provisionally to the 1970s, based on the style and the degree of oxidation. Someone had anchored a descent rope here, perhaps 40 or 50 years ago. Someone who had intended to go deeper and had wanted a way back. At 90 feet, the passage widened briefly before narrowing again, and in the wider section, they found personal items from the 2024 group. Backpacks set down carefully rather than dropped, coils of rope, ice axes leaning against the wall as though their owners had decided they would not be needed further in. This was where the footprints in the snow had led, into this entrance and down, and the equipment told the story of people who had come this far and chosen, consciously, to leave behind the tools that might have helped them leave. "Why would they leave their gear here?" Domenica asked, her headlamp playing across the arranged equipment. Alex had an answer for this, a rational one, the kind he had trained himself to generate. Disorientation from hypoxia, poor judgment from early hypothermia, the irrational certainty that comes with some stages of cold exposure, where a person feels warm when they are freezing and capable when they are failing. He said this out loud and believed it, mostly. They continued downward. At 120 feet, Grant stopped walking. Alex noticed because Grant was in front of him, and the absence of movement ahead registered before any other information. He almost walked into the man's back. Grant was standing very still, his head slightly turned, listening. "What is it?" Alex asked, keeping his voice low, out of instinct. Grant did not answer immediately. When he did, his voice had a careful quality, the voice of someone testing the weight of each word before committing to it. "I hear my daughter," he said. "She is calling from further down. She is asking me to come find her." Alex said, very clearly, "Grant, your daughter is in Billings. You spoke to her yesterday morning." "I know that," Grant said. He paused. "I can still hear her." They stood in the half-dark of the luminous ice for a moment. Alex could hear nothing except the slight creak of the ice structure around them and the sound of his own breathing, amplified by the enclosed space. Then, very faintly, at the lower edge of perception, he thought he heard something. Not a voice he recognized, a tone or a harmonic, something that carried emotional information without being clearly linguistic. Not words, but an impression of words, a sense of direction. "Come further. Come down. There is something I need to show you." He turned to Ruiz. "We continue, but we maintain visual contact at all times. No one moves ahead of the group. No one responds to anything they hear." Ruiz nodded. Grant pulled his gaze from the lower passage with visible effort and fell back into line. They found the main chamber at 160 feet. It was larger than the passage had suggested, opening suddenly from a constricted tunnel into a space perhaps 40 feet across and 20 feet high, and the walls here glowed steadily in that slow, rhythmic way, bright enough now to cast shadows, bright enough to see clearly without headlamps. Alex switched his off. The others followed. The light from the ice was sufficient, and it was wrong in a way that was easier to feel than to describe. Not cold, not warm. Something without temperature that registered in the visual cortex as light, but elsewhere as something that had no name in the ordinary vocabulary of sensation. The chamber held the remnants of at least 3 separate expeditions. One camping setup in the far corner dated, by Hargrove's assessment, to the 1960s. A more recent collection of equipment, possibly late 1980s, arranged near the center. And along the near wall, the personal belongings of the 2024 group, arranged with the same careful deliberateness as the gear in the passage, set down rather than abandoned, as though their owners had expected to return for them. Alex moved to the near wall and found what he was looking for. A journal in a waterproof case, the outside marked in black permanent marker with a name. Lily Cole. He opened it. The final entry was dated November 21st, the second day of the expedition, written in the focused, careful script of someone who was aware they were writing for an unknown reader and wanted to be understood. "We came in to look for shelter from the wind," Lily had written, and the group agreed it seemed stable, so we went a little further, and James wanted to explore. And then the light started, and the voices. They were ours at first. I mean, the voices sounded like people we knew, family and friends. And everyone was so relieved because the sound of a familiar voice in a cold, dark place is the most comforting thing possible. And we all wanted to follow them. I wanted to follow them. I heard my mother, who died 4 years ago, and she sounded exactly right. Every particular of how she laughed and the way she said my name. I almost went. I almost went twice. But I had been watching the light, the way it responded to us, and I realized that every time one of us moved toward it, the light brightened very slightly, like a reward, like a system that had learned what we responded to and was adjusting its output accordingly. That was what stopped me. Not fear. The recognition that I was being managed by something that was optimizing itself in real time, getting better at persuading us with every minute we were in there. James went deeper 20 minutes ago. He said he had to see. I am going to try to bring him back, but I want to leave this here first, because I am not sure I am going to make it back out, and someone needs to know what is down here. It is not a ghost. It is not a hallucination. It is something that learns. Every person who has ever come into this mountain has made it better at what it does. It is ancient, and it is very good at this now. Alex read the entry twice, standing in the light of the pulsing ice walls, and felt the careful structure of his reasoning beginning to develop small cracks. Not collapsing, not yet, but strained. Then Grant said, in a voice from which all his careful professional distance had vanished, leaving something much more unguarded underneath, "It is not just my daughter now. It is everyone I have ever lost. It is all of them at once." Before Alex could respond, Grant walked past him toward the far side of the chamber, where a narrower passage continued downward, moving quickly and with purpose, and by the time Alex reached the passage entrance and called his name, Grant's headlamp was already 30 feet away and descending, and then it was gone around a curve in the tunnel, and the sound of his footsteps faded in the way of something absorbed by a surface that should have reflected it, and there was only the silence, and the light, and the voices that Alex had been refusing to acknowledge since approximately 100 feet into the descent. They did not find Grant. They searched the passage entrance for 40 minutes until the creaking of the ice structure intensified to a degree that Ruiz judged dangerous, at which point he made the call that Alex was simultaneously grateful for and unable to forgive. They retreated upward through the tunnel, back through the chamber, back past the arranged gear and the corroded piton, back to the entrance and the cold, open air of the mountain. And Grant was not with them. Outside, no one spoke for several minutes. The wind had picked up, driving ice crystals horizontally across the slope, and the sky was closing toward another storm. Alex stood apart from the others and pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes and thought about what had just happened, with the systematic care of a person performing a function that feels like it might stop if he does not actively maintain it. Domenica was quietly crying. Park had his radio out and was reporting the situation to the staging area below in a flat, careful voice that kept threatening to break. Hargrove was sitting on a rock with his equipment bag in his lap and an expression that Alex recognized from his own mirror after particularly bad weeks. The expression of a person reassessing a fundamental assumption about the nature of the world. "We have to go back in," Alex said. Ruiz looked at him. "The storm that is coming in the next 4 hours will trap us on this slope overnight if we do not descend now." Grant made his choice. "We cannot follow him." Alex wanted to argue and did not, because Ruiz was right in all the ways that could be measured, and the ways it was wrong were not the kind that could be put into an incident report. They descended to the staging area. Alex spent the evening in the operations room, reading. He had asked Haynes for access to historical disappearance records for the Bitterroot Range, going back as far as records existed, and Haynes had sent a file by secure server that evening, a file whose existence had not been previously advertised in any public database Alex had ever accessed. The file contained records of disappearances in the specific grid coordinates of their current investigation, going back to 1931. 37 separate incidents over 93 years, ranging from single individuals to groups of 6 or 8. In every case, the official determination had been death by exposure or accident. In 7 of the cases, notes from the original investigators had been appended to the file, written in the hedged, careful language of people documenting something they were not willing to name directly. The 1973 case had a note that read, "Surviving member recovered at cave entrance in hypoxic state, unable to give coherent account of events, references to voices and light, recommend no further investigation of cave system on psychological grounds." The 1988 case had a note that read, 3 victims located below ice formation, positioned in line, equipment abandoned in passage, no evidence of distress at time of death. Recommend restricting public access to area, classification pending review. And at the very back of the file, attached as a separate document with a different classification header, was a handwritten report from 1968 in ink that had faded but remained legible. The report was from a man named Beaumont, listed as affiliated with a federal agency whose name had been redacted. Beaumont had investigated a 1968 disappearance in the same coordinates. His report was 7 pages long, and Alex read it twice, slowly. On the 3rd page, Beaumont wrote, "The phenomenon demonstrates adaptive behavior consistent with a learning system. Initial survivors from the 1930s and 1940s reported primitive stimulus, undifferentiated sound and light. By the 1950s, survivors described voices without specific content. The 1963 case produced the first reports of personalized audio, voices of known individuals speaking recognizable language. The 1968 cohort reported voices that not only recognized them, but demonstrated knowledge of private information that could only have been obtained from previous victims. The progression is consistent with a system that acquires and processes information from each encounter and applies it to subsequent encounters. In lay terms, it is getting better at this every time. Each person who enters that cave makes it more effective for the next person. This is not a metaphor. This is what the data shows. On the final page, Beaumont had written a single recommendation in a different color ink, added apparently at a later date. Permanent sealing of the cave system is inadequate. The entity, for lack of a better term, does not require the physical cave to operate. The cave is simply where it has accumulated the most density of experience. Dreams reported by survivors across multiple decades demonstrate that proximity is not required for effect. This is either a very long-range phenomenon, or the cave is simply the clearest signal. Either way, sealing the entrance addresses the access problem, not the fundamental one. I do not have a recommendation for the fundamental one. Alex sat with this document for a long time. He thought about Lily Cole's observation, the thing that had stopped her where the voices had not. The recognition that she was being managed by something optimizing itself in real time. He thought about Grant walking away down that passage with everything he had lost suddenly available to him, all of it offered at once, in a dark corridor where the ice glowed like something alive. He thought about Noah. He had not heard Noah's voice in the cave. He was not sure whether this meant the entity had not yet assembled a sufficient model of his brother, or whether it had simply decided that it did not need to use that particular voice to reach Alex Carter. Perhaps it had been saving it. Perhaps it was still waiting for the right moment. He closed Beaumont's report and opened his notebook and wrote until the lamp above him flickered in a way that might have been the generator and might have been something else. The second entry took place 48 hours later, after the storm had passed, and after a significant amount of discussion between Alex and Director Haynes that took place partly in phone calls, and partly in a series of messages that Alex suspected were being read by people he had never met. The team this time was smaller by one. They did not discuss Grant. The official record would eventually describe his disappearance as an accident resulting from disorientation in an unstable cave environment, which was accurate the way a map is accurate, which is to say true in its general features and entirely wrong about the texture of the thing. Alex led the descent with Ruiz and Hargrove, leaving Domenica and Park at the entrance. He had told himself several things in the 48 hours since the first entry, and the things he had told himself had a different quality than they used to. They were true. He was fairly confident they were true, but they no longer felt invulnerable in the way that rational explanations used to feel for him, like a room with solid walls. They felt more like a hell. He was aware that this was itself a warning sign, and he documented it carefully in his notebook that morning, and went into the cave anyway, because there was still a man somewhere in those tunnels who might be alive, and there was still a question that needed answering, and Alex Carter had never stopped looking, because stopping felt like the same as losing Noah twice. They reached the main chamber without incident. The light pulsed slowly. The temperature was, if anything, lower than before. Hargrove moved to the geological formations and began taking readings with the focused efficiency of a man converting something frightening into data. Ruiz stood at the center of the chamber with his back to the lower passage, a position Alex recognized as deliberate. Alex went to the far corner of the chamber where the 1960s camping equipment had been preserved in the ice. He had been thinking about this since reading Beaumont's report. If the entity accumulated information from its victims and used that information to become more persuasive, then the earliest victims were the least informed witnesses, the least contaminated by the entity's influence on their language and perception. He wanted to find the oldest account available, the closest thing to a first contact record that existed in this chamber. What he found was a small metal tin wedged in a crack in the ice near the floor, the kind of tin that might once have held tobacco or hard candy. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a folded piece of paper covered in very small handwriting. The paper was dated September 14, 1961, and the author identified himself as a member of a three-person surveying team that had taken shelter in the cave during an unexpected storm. His account was simple and specific, and unlike the later accounts, in one significant way. He did not describe the voices as familiar. He described them as correct. Not as sounding like people he knew, but as saying things that were true. "Every fear I had brought to that mountain," he wrote, "it named accurately. Not in anyone's voice in particular, but in a tone that seemed to come from inside my own head rather than from outside. My companions were transfixed by it immediately. I found myself transfixed as well, but I had the unusual experience of also being afraid of how transfixed I was. And this fear was slightly stronger than the transfixion, and I ran. I believe this is the only reason I am writing this. The thing in this cave is not malevolent in any recognizable sense. It does not hate you. It is more accurate to say that it does not know you are a person. To it, I believe we are simply material, a source of the information it uses to become more complete. We go into it the way light goes into a lens." Alex read this, and then he heard his brother's voice. It came from the lower passage, from the direction Grant had gone, and it was Noah at 17, the last age Alex could hear clearly in his memory. The summer before the camping trip. "Hey, Al, you found me. I knew you would find me. Come down, there is something I have to tell you, and I can only tell you down here, and I have been waiting so long." Alex stood very still. The voice was exactly right, not approximately right, not the kind of almost right that occurs in dreams when memory degrades the original. It was Noah at 17, with the particular grain of his voice when he was excited about something, the speed of his syllables, the way he said the short A in Alex, like the A in hat. It was so right that Alex's throat closed, and his eyes burned, and his feet moved toward the passage entrance before his conscious mind registered that they were moving. He stopped himself at the passage lip with one hand against the wall. He stood there breathing. The voice continued from below, patient and warm and perfectly calibrated, each sentence landing in the exact place where it would do the most damage. He made himself think about Lily Cole, watching the light brighten as her group moved toward it. He made himself think about Beaumont's report, 60 years of accumulated victims feeding a system that had learned from each one how to be more persuasive for the next. He made himself think about what Noah actually would have said, his actual brother in the world, and how his actual brother would not have told him to come deeper into a mountain. His actual brother would have told him to go home. He stepped back from the passage entrance and turned around and nearly walked into Ruiz, who had apparently crossed the chamber without making any sound, and was now standing 2 feet away with a hand ready to catch him. Neither of them said anything. Ruiz looked at Alex with the expression of someone who has just watched another person make a decision at considerable personal cost, and does not know the appropriate response to that. Alex looked back at him. After a moment, he nodded, and Ruiz lowered his hand. "It does not stop when you recognize it," Alex said. His voice came out steady. He was grateful for this. The voice from below continued. He made himself hear it as a recording rather than a presence. A highly accurate simulation running on information extracted from the dead. "I know," Ruiz said. "My brother has been calling to me from the right side passage for the past 12 minutes. My brother lives in Albuquerque." Hargrove had found what he came for and was ready to leave. They gathered their documentation and climbed. The controlled demolition took place on the morning of December 4th, 2 weeks after Alex had first landed in Missoula. It was conducted by a federal engineering team that had arrived 3 days earlier and worked with a speed and precision that told Alex this was not the first time they had done something like this. Director Haynes was present. Several individuals whose agency affiliations were not made explicit were also present. Alex stood at the designated observation point on a ridge a quarter-mile from the ice formation and watched the sequential charges go in, and watched the mountain accept them with a sound like something very old being interrupted mid-sentence. And when the noise and the settling debris were finished, the ice formation was gone, and the entrance was sealed under 40 feet of new rock and ice. The official determination in the case of the 8 Bozeman hikers was death by hypothermia and exposure, complicated by disorientation within an unstable natural cave system. James Cole's body was not recovered and was listed as presumed deceased. Grant's disappearance was classified as an accident occurring during the recovery operation, and his family was told what families are told in these situations, which is the kind of thing that is not exactly false and is exactly not enough. Lily Cole's carved message and journal were classified and removed from the official record. Beaumont's 1968 report was already classified and remained so. The case was closed. If you are watching this, and something about that last sentence made you uneasy, you are paying attention. The case was closed. Not solved, not understood. Closed, the way you close a drawer that has something in it you do not want to look at. 8 people went into that mountain. 7 came out as bodies. 1 did not come out at all. And the families of every one of them received a document that said exposure and disorientation and unstable terrain, because that is the document that gets written, because the other document, the one that tells the truth, goes into a file that you and I will never see. If that bothers you as much as it bothers us, hit the subscribe button below and join the people who think these stories deserve to be told completely, not just the parts that are easy to put in a report. We publish every week, and we do not close cases just because the answers are uncomfortable. Alex submitted his report and flew home to Denver. He returned to his apartment and fed his cat and paid the bills and called his mother and kept the dentist appointment he had been mildly dreading. He did his job. He found a missing child in a drainage system in February, and an elderly woman who had wandered from her care home in March, and a young man who had gotten into a car with the wrong person in April. And in each case, he followed the evidence wherever it led and found the answer. And the answers were terrible and true, and brought some measure of rest to people who needed it. He did not go back to Montana. The dreams started 3 weeks after he returned. They were not frightening, which was worse than if they had been frightening. They were warm. In the dreams, he was in the cave, and the light was pulsing slowly around him, and the voices of everyone he had lost were present simultaneously. All of them at the same register. All of them saying his name with the particular affection specific to each person. And in the dreams, there was no urgency and no cold. Only the sense of being completely known and found, which was the thing he had been looking for since he was 23 years old, and which the mountain had apparently taken careful note of. He told no one about the dreams. He told his therapist he was sleeping adequately. He purchased blackout curtains and a white noise machine, and these things helped with the sleep, but did not affect the content of it. In August, he received a message from a woman named Harrington, who identified herself as a researcher at an organization whose name Alex did not recognize, though the government address on the email told him something about its affiliations. She wrote that she had read his report and was doing a longer-term study of cases like the Bitterroot incident, and asked if he would be willing to speak with her. She mentioned, carefully and in passing, that 3 other investigators who had worked similar cases in other locations were participating in the study. Other locations. Alex read this phrase several times. He wrote back and asked, "What other locations?" Harrington replied with a list of 6 coordinates: northern Canada, the Norwegian coast, a mountain range in the interior of Japan, a desert region in Kazakhstan that Alex would not have identified as a likely candidate, the Andes, and one in the American South that he recognized immediately as the location of an incident from 2019 that he had been aware of tangentially. A case of 8 hikers who had vanished and been found in a formation that the official report had described, in language whose careful neutrality now struck Alex differently than it had at the time, as consistent with disorientation and exposure. He looked at the list for a long time. Then he opened Beaumont's report, which he had photographed before the federal team arrived, and read again the final paragraph. The entity does not require the physical cave to operate. The cave is simply where it has accumulated the most density of experience. Either way, sealing the entrance addresses the access problem, not the fundamental one. I do not have a recommendation for the fundamental one. Alex closed the document. Outside his window, the Denver sky was the particular clear blue of a late summer evening, the kind of sky that looks like nothing can go wrong under it. He thought about what he was going to write back to Harrington. He thought about Lily Cole at the entrance of the cave, going in to find her brother even after writing down the warning, because knowing the danger and being willing to enter it anyway is sometimes the same decision. He thought about Noah. He wrote back to Harrington, "I am available. When do we start?" That night he dreamed about the mountain, and in the dream the voice was clearer than it had ever been. And when he woke at 3 a.m., with his heart running hard and the room dark around him, he lay still and made himself say out loud the thing that had woken him. Not the voice, not the warmth or the light or the feeling of being completely known. What had woken him was the moment just before all of that. The moment he had noticed, even in the dream, that the voice had gotten better again, more specific, more accurate, more convincing than the night before, which meant it was still learning, which meant it had found a way to keep doing what it did without the cave, without the ice, without the mountain, through the only channel that remained available to it, the one channel that the demolition had left open, and that no amount of rock and ice could seal, the channel of memory and recognition and the particular human hunger to be found by something that knows your name. Alex got up and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table in the dark and waited for morning. The coffee went cold. He drank it anyway. "Before we go, we want to ask you something directly." Harrington's list had 6 locations, 6 places in the world where the same pattern had played out, the same line of bodies, the same arranged equipment, the same peaceful faces, the same sealed files and sanitized reports. 6 places we know about. Think about that number, and then think about how many cases you have heard of over the years that ended with the words "cause undetermined" or "consistent with exposure," and ask yourself whether the number 6 still feels right to you. Leave your answer in the comments. We read every one of them, and some of the most important leads in stories like this one have come from people who remembered something they were told not to think too hard about. The story of what is in that mountain, what is in all those mountains, is not over. It is never over. It is just waiting for someone to keep asking.